3 days after Warren Hale was buried, Eli Hale drove the old John Deere out to the northwest edge of the field. The patch of pale, chalk-white ground that never warmed when it should. The wind still carried winter in it. It dragged dust through broken stalks and rattled the barbed wire low and steady. No one in Baca County saw promise in that ground. They saw stubborn soil, late thaw, shallow roots. When Eli dropped the ripper, Boyd Mercer was already there, leaning against his truck by the roadside. "You're tearing up the worst piece of land you own," Boyd called out. "Right after burying your father." Eli didn't answer. The tractor shook beneath him. The blade bit down. The ground screened back, dry, sharp, resistant. In his coat pocket was a folded piece of paper. Not a will, not instructions. Just one line written in Warren Hale's tight hand. "The frost leaves this patch last for a reason." That was all. No dig, no water. Ruth had found it in an old seed ledger and handed it to Eli without explanation. "Your father never wrote anything down unless he'd seen it more than once." Warren Hale had never explained anything. He walked the land after every rain, every thaw, every hard wind. He watched where water lingered, where soil stayed cold, where things didn't behave the way they should. When Eli was younger, he thought it was stubbornness. Now he wasn't so sure. Last season had been thin. He came early. Crops came up uneven. By fall, the cattle tanks were low. And now Warren was gone. The bills hadn't gone with him. Boyd had already offered a solution. "Drill deep," he'd said. "One well, 30 years of water." By Saturday, people in town were laughing. They said Eli was digging up the same dead patch his father used to stare at. They said he was burying what little money he had left. Eli heard all of it. He didn't respond. The ripper struck again. The tractor jolted. A white fracture opened in the soil behind it. Caliche. Hard, chalky ground that held everything in the wrong place. Eli had tried to break it once, years ago. Warren had stopped him. Not yet. It was never yet with him. Not time to borrow. Not time to replace. Not time to trust anything that came too easy. And now Eli was here, tearing it open because of a single line that explained nothing. He killed the engine. Silence dropped hard. He stepped down, knelt, and brushed the pale dust aside. Beneath it, the soil was darker, colder. Not wind cold, ground cold. He unfolded the paper again. At the bottom were smaller notes. "Snow sinks here before noon, but leaves late. Buffalo grass stays green 10 days longer. Iron rod rings hollow 2 spans east of the post." Eli stared at the last line. Rings hollow. He remembered the steel rod his father used for fence posts. The way he'd drive it down, pause, listen, then move. And it looked like habit. Now it felt like something else. From the road, Boyd called again. "Last chance, Eli. Price goes up after today." Eli folded the paper, slid it back into his pocket, and stood. "I'll keep my land," he said. Boyd watched him, then shook his head. "Ground like that swallows people." The truck door slammed. Then he was gone. Eli walked to the shed, and came back with a shovel, a pickaxe, and the old steel rod. The handle was worn smooth where his father's hands had held it. Eli gripped it tighter. He stepped onto the white ground, drove the rod down. Kang. Solid. He moved. Drove it again. Kang. Still solid. He moved once more. Drove it deeper. The sound changed. Not sharp, not hard. Hollow. A low echo that disappeared into something beneath the surface. Eli froze. The wind moved across the field. He drove the rod down again. Slower. Listening. The hollow sound came back. Steady. Unmistakable. Eli Hale stood over that patch of stubborn ground and understood. He wasn't just breaking soil. He was opening something his father had already found. Eli didn't start digging right away. He stood there for a long time, the steel rod still in his hand, listening to the silence after that hollow sound faded. The wind moved. The wire hummed. Nothing else changed. But something had. He marked the spot with the heel of his boot, then stepped back and looked at the ground the way his father used to, without hurry, without reaching for a tool too quickly. 2 paces east of the old fence post. That was what the note said. Eli walked it out again, slower this time. 1, 2. He stopped, turned, and drove the rod down once more. Hollow. The same low, muted echo. He set the rod aside and picked up the shovel. The first layer came up easy, dry topsoil, loose from years of being broken and rebroken by sun and wind. It crumbled under the blade, light and familiar. At a foot down, the soil changed. Heavier. Finer. Holding together just a little longer before breaking apart. Normal. He kept digging. By the second foot, sweat had started to form along his neck despite the cold air. The wind dried it almost as quickly as it came. At 3 feet, the shovel hit resistance. A dull, flat knock. Eli paused, leaned on the handle, then scraped the blade sideways. White. Not dust this time. Solid. Caliche. There you are. He cleared more of it, widening the hole just enough to see the layer stretch out beyond the edges, flat, pale, and hard as poured stone. The same layer that had ruined crops on this patch for years. The same layer his father had refused to break. Eli sat back on his heels, breathing steady, looking at it. If Warren had known this was here, and he had, then this wasn't where most men would start digging. This was where they stopped. He reached for the pickaxe. The first strike rang sharp. Metal against hardened ground. The second strike chipped a fragment loose. The third drove a crack across the surface, thin but visible. Eli leaned closer. The crack wasn't random. It followed a line. Subtle. Slightly darker. Running across the layer like something that had been there long before he ever put a tool into it. He brushed the dust away with his hand. The line continued, northwest to southeast, just like the limestone ridge his father had marked on the old sketch. Eli didn't speak. He raised the pick again, and brought it down directly along that line. The crack widened. Not much. Just enough. He set the pick aside and grabbed the steel rod. Slowly, carefully, he pressed the tip into the opening. It slid in. Too easily. No resistance. No hard stop. Just space. Eli pulled it back out and stared at the tip. Damp. He frowned, rubbed it between his fingers. Cold. Colder than the air. He leaned forward again and drove the rod deeper into the crack. This time it sank farther. Deeper than the length of his hand. Still no resistance. He set the rod aside and widened the opening with the pick, working along the line instead of against it now. Piece by piece, the caliche broke apart. Not easily, but not the way solid stone should. Like something fractured long ago, just waiting to be opened the rest of the way. The hole was nearly 4 feet deep when he saw it. Not water. Not yet. Just darkness in the crack below the white layer. A narrow space filled with loose gravel and fine sand, different from the soil above, different from the hard layer he'd just broken through. Eli reached down and scooped a handful. It shifted between his fingers. Cool. Loose. Alive in a way the soil above it wasn't. He dug faster now. Not wild, not careless, but with purpose. Every shovelful widened the opening. Every strike followed the same line his father had somehow traced without ever breaking the surface. The wind picked up again, carrying dust across the edge of the hole. Eli didn't notice. At 5 feet, the gravel layer deepened. At 5.5, the bottom gave slightly under his weight. And then a sound. Soft. Faint. Like something shifting under pressure. Eli froze. He held still, listening. Nothing. Just the wind. He exhaled, slow, then drove the shovel down again, right into the base of the crack. The blade slid deeper than before. Too deep. As if something beneath had opened. Eli pulled the shovel back. And this time, the bottom of the hole darkened. Not from shadow, from moisture. He dropped to his knees, pressed his hand against the exposed gravel. Cold. Wet. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. Then he leaned closer, watching. A bead of water formed between the stones, small, clear. It held for a second, then slipped free. Another followed. And another. Slow. Steady. Unhurried. Eli sat back, his hands resting in the dirt. Eyes fixed on that single point where the ground was beginning to give something back. No rush. No burst. Just a quiet, patient rising. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded paper, and opened it again. The lines stared back at him. The frost leaves this patch last for a reason. Eli looked down into the hole. At the damp gravel. At the thin trickle beginning to gather. At the place his father had marked without ever touching. You knew. The wind moved across the field again, and beneath it, the ground, for the first time in years, was no longer dry.
Eli didn't tell anyone that first day. He stayed by the hole until the light began to fade, watching the slow darkening of the gravel as the water continued to gather. It wasn't much, just a thin seep, a quiet trickle threading its way through stone and sand. But it didn't stop. By late afternoon, the bottom of the hole held a shallow film, no more than a few inches across, barely enough to reflect the sky. Eli crouched there, one hand resting on his knee, the other hovering just above the surface. He lowered his fingers into it, cold, not surface cold, not the kind the wind leaves behind. This was deeper than that. He pulled his hand back slowly, studying the droplets clinging to his skin, clear, no sediment, no clouding, just water. He looked out across the rest of the field, dry rows, cracked patches, dust riding low along the ground, and here. In the one place everyone said was useless, the earth was giving something back. Eli stood up. He didn't smile, didn't shout, didn't run back to the house. He just picked up the shovel again. The next morning, he was back before the sun cleared the horizon. The air bit harder at dawn. Frost still clung to the edges of the field, thin and brittle. Everywhere except the hole. There, the ground stayed dark, soft, breathing in a way the rest of the land didn't. Eli set to work. He widened the pit carefully, following the line of the fracture instead of cutting across it. Every move deliberate, every strike measured. The gravel layer deepened, the seep strengthened. Not fast, never fast, but steady. By midday, the trickle had turned into a thin, constant thread, water slipping between stones, collecting at the base, rising just enough that he had to pause every few minutes to let it settle before digging further. Eli adjusted. He stopped fighting the water, started working with it. He carved the edges wider, sloped the sides slightly, letting the flow gather without collapsing the walls. The way his father had shaped irrigation channels years ago. The way he'd always said, water will show you how it wants to move. Eli hadn't understood that then. He did now. By the third day, the hole held water even before he touched a tool,
a shallow pool, clear enough to see the gravel beneath it shift as the flow continued from below. He measured it without thinking, watching how long it took to rise after he cleared it, how fast it returned when he stepped away. Slow, consistent, reliable. That afternoon, Boyd Mercer came back. This time he didn't call out from the road. He walked down to the edge of the pit and stood there, hands on his hips, looking in. Neither man spoke at first. Boyd tilted his head slightly, watching the surface. How deep? Just under 5.5. That water been sitting long? Eli shook his head.
Comes back every time I clear it. Boyd crouched, picked up a small stone, and dropped it into the pool. They both watched the ripples spread, then settle, then slowly, the level rise again. That ain't runoff, Boyd said. No. Boyd straightened, eyes narrowing slightly, as he looked out across the field, then back at the hole. You hit a pocket. Eli didn't answer. My father marked it. Boyd glanced at him. For what? Eli hesitated, then reached into his pocket, and unfolded the paper. He handed it over. Boyd read the line once. Then again. The frost leaves this patch last. He let out a short breath through his nose. That's all he wrote. That's all he needed. Boyd handed the paper back. Still not enough to run a farm. No, Eli said. But it's enough to start one. Boyd looked at the water again. Longer this time. Then he turned, walked back toward his truck without another word. Eli watched him go. Then turned back to the hole. He worked through the rest of the week. Morning to dusk. Breaking more of the caliche. Following the fracture as it widened slightly the deeper he went. Shaping the pit into something stable. Something that wouldn't collapse under its own weight. The water kept coming. Not stronger. Not weaker. Just constant. By the 7th day, the pool held nearly a foot of water. Enough that he had to step carefully along the edges. Enough that the surface stayed smooth even when the wind moved across it. On the 8th morning, Eli brought a length of scrap pipe from the shed. He set it along the lowest edge of the pit and carved a shallow channel leading away from the pool. The first time the water reached the lip, it hesitated, then tipped over. A thin stream slipping out, finding its own path down the slope. Eli followed it with his eyes as it moved across the dry ground, darkening the dust, cutting a narrow line where nothing had held moisture in years. He crouched again, one hand resting on the edge of the pit, listening, watching, learning, the way his father had. For the first time since the funeral, the weight in his chest shifted. Not gone, but different. Less like something pressing down, more like something opening. Eli Hale sat beside that small, quiet spring, and understood that what his father had left behind wasn't just water. It was a way of seeing that had taken a lifetime to learn. By the time the second week ended, the hole was no longer a hole. It had edges now. Shape. A purpose. Eli had lined the sides with flat stone pulled from the broken caliche, stacking them tight enough to hold, loose enough to breathe. The water rose through the gravel beneath and settled into a clear basin that no longer collapsed under his boots. It wasn't large, but it was steady. At sunrise, the surface sat still and clean, like glass laid into the earth. By noon, it shimmered under the wind. By evening, it was still there. Unchanged. Eli stopped measuring it after a while. He didn't need numbers to know what it was doing. It came back. Every time. He ran a narrow trench from the edge of the basin, down the slope toward the lower field, just enough to guide the overflow. The first few days, the water barely reached it. Then it did. And once it started moving, it didn't stop. A thin line at first, then a steady thread. Not strong enough to rush, not weak enough to disappear, just constant. He laid pipe the following afternoon, nothing complicated,
just enough to carry the flow cleanly without losing it to the dirt. No pump. No engine. No noise. Gravity did the work. The same way it always had. By the third week, the change was visible. Not everywhere. Just in small, quiet ways, the strip of ground below the basin darkened first. Then softened, then held. Eli pressed his boot into it one morning and felt it give, not collapse, not crumble, just yield. He stood there longer than he meant to. Feeling it, remembering. The cattle noticed before anyone else. They drifted toward the lower end of the field where the trench emptied, sniffing, stepping carefully, then lowering their heads to drink from the shallow pool that had formed there. No hesitation. No training, they knew. Eli leaned against the fence and watched them. He didn't call them in. Didn't drive them away, he let them find it on their own. Word spread anyway. It always did. First one truck stopped at the road, then another. Men stood at the edge of the field with their hands in their pockets, looking down toward the basin like they weren't quite sure what they were seeing. No one laughed this time. One of them finally walked down. Dale Rooker, farmed 2 sections south. He stood beside Eli without speaking, then nodded toward the water. How long's it been doing that? Since the first day. Has it dropped? No. Dale crouched, dipped his fingers in, then rubbed them together like he expected to feel something else. Cold, he said. Yeah. He stood up, looked across the field, then back at Eli. You hit it blind. Eli shook his head once. My father didn't. Dale didn't ask anything else, he just nodded again, slower this time, then walked back to his truck.
Boyd Mercer came back a few days later. This time he didn't bring a sales pitch. He stood at the basin, hands on his hips, watching the water move through the pipe and down into the lower ground. Quiet. Longer than before. How much you figure it's putting out? He asked. Eli shrugged slightly. Enough. Boyd let out a breath. Almost a laugh, but not quite. I've been selling wells 20 years, he said. Never seen anyone pull water out of the ground with a shovel and a sentence. Eli didn't respond. He just looked at the basin. Boyd nodded once, more to himself than to Eli. Then he turned and walked away. No offer. No numbers. Just gone. That evening, Eli went back to the shed and brought out a longer length of pipe. He adjusted the angle, smoothed the trench, let the water carry farther this time. By the end of the month, a strip of green had begun to form where there had been nothing but dust. Not wide, not impressive, but alive. Eli knelt there one morning, running his hand through the damp soil, breaking it apart, feeling the weight of it. It held together. It stayed. It didn't disappear the way the rest of the field did after a dry wind. He sat back on his heels and looked up slope toward the basin, toward the place his father had marked, without ever digging. You left it for me. The thought didn't come with certainty. It didn't need to. It settled in slowly, the same way the water had. Warren Hale could have broken that ground himself, could have hired it done, could have proven it. Instead, he wrote a single line and folded it away. Eli understood why now. Because the water wasn't the only thing hidden in that ground. The digging mattered. The waiting mattered. The doubt mattered. He stood up, wiped his hands against his jeans, and looked out across the rest of the farm. Dry land, hard land, land that hadn't changed, not yet. But something had shifted. Not in the soil. In him. Eli Hale turned back toward the basin, the quiet flow, the narrow line of green beginning to take hold, and knew this wasn't the end of what his father had left behind. It was only the part he could see. By midsummer, the water had found its rhythm. It didn't rush, it didn't slow. It simply continued, day after day, rising through the gravel, spilling into the basin, then slipping down the pipe into the lower field like it had always been meant to do exactly that. Eli stopped thinking of it as something new. It wasn't, it had been there long before him, long before his father ever wrote that line down. All he had done was open it. The strip of green below the basin widened through June, then deepened. The soil held moisture longer. The surface stayed cool even under the midday sun. Where dust used to lift with every step, the ground now stayed in place. Eli planted there first. Not much, just enough to see. Rose took hold. Stronger than the rest of the field, more even, less fragile. He didn't talk about it in town, didn't explain it, but people saw. They always did. By July, the difference was no longer something you had to look for. It was there, clear, a narrow band of life running through land that had spent years giving less than it took. One evening, Ruth stood at the edge of it beside him. She didn't step into the soil, just looked, hands folded, quiet. "Your father used to stand out here," she said softly. "Same place." Eli nodded. "I remember." Ruth watched the water move through the pipe, then down into the field. He never said what he was looking for. "No," Eli said. "He just kept looking." She turned slightly toward him. "He thought you'd understand eventually." Eli didn't answer right away. He looked at the basin up the slope, at the line cut through the earth, at the place where the ground had finally given something back. "I didn't. Not until now." Ruth nodded once, like that was enough. Then she turned and walked back toward the house. Eli stayed, watching the water, listening to the quiet way it moved. He thought about the years his father had spent walking this land. Every rain, every thaw, every season where nothing seemed to change. 40 years of watching something no one else noticed. 40 years of not needing to prove it to anyone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded paper again. The edges were softer now, worn, handled too many times. "The frost leaves this patch last for a reason." Eli folded it back up carefully, slid it into his pocket, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a mystery. It felt like an answer. Late that summer, Boyd Mercer drove past again. He didn't stop, just slowed enough to look out across the field, at the green strip, at the cattle gathered near the lower pool, at the pipe running steady without sound. Then he kept going. By August, Eli extended the line further.
Another section. Not fast. Never fast. Just enough. Always enough. He didn't borrow money. Didn't sign anything. Didn't need to. The land began to change in small ways. Subtle ways. The kind you wouldn't notice, unless you were looking for them. The way his father had. One evening, just before the light dropped, Eli stood alone by the basin again. The wind had settled. The surface of the water was still, clear enough to see the gravel beneath shift as the flow continued from below. He crouched, dipped his hand in, then lifted it slowly. Cold, steady, unchanging. 40 years, he said under his breath. Not in disbelief, not in awe, just recognition. He looked out across the field, at the dry land that remained, at the narrow green that had begun, at the work still ahead. Then back at the water, at the place his father had marked and left untouched. You weren't leaving me water. Eli let the silence sit for a moment, then nodded slightly. You were teaching me how to find it. The wind returned, softer now, moving across the field, carrying dust where the ground was still dry, and passing gently over the place where it no longer was. Eli Hale stood there until the last light faded, then turned back toward the house, leaving the water to keep doing what it had always done, long before anyone fought to dig.